Okay, welcome everybody. I'll call this committee of the whole to order. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the Northern Rockies Administration Center is located in the heart of the traditional territory of the Dene, Cree, and Dunesaw people of Fort Nelson and Prophet River First Nations. We further recognize the rights provided by our treaty. And finally, we also celebrate the contributions and the enduring presence of the Métis people in our region. Please be advised that tonight's meeting is available to the public to attend virtually, is being streamed live and recorded. Are there any additions? Council? CAO?
No acting, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, are there any attendees who wish to comment on the agenda? Anyone online? Anyone in the gallery? Hearing none, I'll ask for a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Can I get a mover? Moved by Councillor Enoch, seconded by Councillor Andrews. All in favor? Opposed? That carries. New business. We have our Emergency Operations Center overview. Deputy Corporate Administrative Officer Erin LaVale, please take it away.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen here quickly. All right. All right, so for those who are returning to the council chambers, it's a very similar presentation to 4 years ago. So we're just going to do a fairly broad introduction to emergency management and how it interacts with us as a local government, plus just some of the changes that have occurred in the emergency management arena over the last few years. So I like this slide because it kind of shows a bit of the relationship between the local authority, who is at the bottom of that pyramid, up to the federal government, who is at the top. So there is a definite inverse relationship when it comes to authority and delegation of powers in relation to the escalation of response. So our authority and delegation is handed from the federal government down to the provincial government, down through us, through a series of legislation. And I'm going to go over really high review of those pieces of legislation. But on the inverse side of it is that escalation of response. And what happens is at the local level, if things are escalated to a higher degree, of course, it goes up to the provincial level and then up to the federal level. So it's just that inverse relationship that I think is really, really important. There's been two events over the last couple of years that have really highlighted this relationship and how it works. The first one I'm just going to talk about is the floods in Abbotsford. So as that flooding was occurring, some people may be aware that those floodwaters were actually coming across the border from our neighbors to the south. They were crossing the US-Canada border and they were flooding in the area of the Abbotsford and Chilliwack. So within that area, of course, there's lots of local governments that would have activated their emergency responses to deal with that flooding. But the minute that flooding sort of overtook those individual local governments' abilities to respond, and it sort of crossed over particularly provincial infrastructure, i.e. the highways, that's where that escalation of response went up to the province. So then the province took over that coordination of response. And that's kind of an example of how you see when a local government gets overwhelmed, it goes up to the province. One of the ways in which that relationship was also demonstrated was during COVID. So for those who were on council might recall, right at the start of COVID, it was on March 26, 2020, the minister enacted Ministerial Order 84. So that order basically reversed this authority and delegation of powers. So instead of the province delegating the emergency management down into local governments, it actually took it away. So it took away local governments' abilities to declare a state of local emergency in response to COVID. It actually took that power away from local government. So it has the authority to give and it also has the authority to take away. So it does go both ways on that one. So federally, there's a couple of big federal statutes that sets out the broad responsibilities. The one that most people might be most familiar with over the last couple of years has been the Emergencies Act. So enacted in 1988, it's only been invoked once, and that was in February of 2022 in response to the protests in Ottawa. So that is the only time that the Emergencies Act has been enacted since this version of it was put in place. The Emergency Management Act at the federal level is more of a guide. It's more of the how-to. It's setting out what the standards are going to be for the federal departments to respond in the event of an emergency. The Emergencies Act is that the federal version of a state of the federal version of a declaration of a state of emergency. So those are the two at the federal level. At the provincial level, there's a number of legislation plus some acts and a couple of regulations in there. The top one is the Emergency Program Management Regulation. This one is how the province handles emergency management within their own ministries. So how the Ministry of Transportation, how the Ministry of Environment, how they handle emergency management. The bottom three, the Emergency Program Act and the Local Authority Emergency Management Regulation and the Compensation and Disaster Financial Assistance Regulation. Those three are how we interact with the ministry, with the provincial ministries, and it is what defines our authorities and responsibilities. So the Emergency Program Act is the broader one. It defines all of our responsibilities, and it sort of lays out the minimum standards as to what our emergency program must look like, what it must contain, and how we must act, and how we interact with the provincial government. The Local Authority Emergency Management Regulation and the Compensation Regulation sort of give us a bit of a guide in the how we do things. As part of the province's modernization program for emergency management, those three acts are under broad sweeping changes right now. So they're doing a complete revision of the Emergency Program Act, which is going to make some changes to those bottom two regulations. So they've been undertaking this modernization program, I'm going to say, for about 4 years now. They paused during COVID, but they haven't given us a date as to when it's going to be complete. But we've been involved in a lot of the consultation steps along the way, and I am expecting some big changes. Particularly, the current Emergency Program Act is very focused on response. It's very focused on your emergency response plans. It's very focused on the capacity in local governments to respond in case of an emergency. They're really, really focusing the preparation, the preparedness, and the mitigation. How do we prevent these things in the first place? So I am expecting more powers and more authorities driven down from the provincial government to local governments around that mitigation and around that preventiveness versus a lot more in the response area. So as a local authority, we have one bylaw that covers our emergency management program, and that's bylaw 587. It basically details the emergency program and it outlines the roles and responsibilities within it. So as a local authority, we have been directed in a number of ways to do certain things. So from the province, we've been directed that we must establish an emergency management organization. We have been directed that we must have an emergency response plan, which encompasses the entire municipality. We may establish a local emergency program executive committee. We must appoint an emergency program coordinator. And through this process, we delegate some of our powers and duties under the Emergency Program Act to that committee, the emergency management organization, or the coordinator, all except for that one power, which is to make a declaration of a state of local emergency. So you can stop me if you have any questions. So what is a state of a local emergency? So a state of a local emergency is under the Emergency Program Act, it's when a local authority requires extraordinary powers and it needs to enact what's known as a state of local emergency to utilize those powers. So most commonly on this screen, the one that we tend to use the most often is to control or prohibit travel to or from any part of the municipality. And this is when we do an evacuation order. We would enact that particular power, and it's the state of local emergency, and it's the declaration of that state of local emergency that gives us that power and that authority. So in our history, we tend to use, the mayor can declare a state of local emergency. He or she should, shortly after doing that, convene a meeting of the council to discuss that state of local emergency. And any of the powers that the emergency program coordinator has recommended that get implemented as part of that emergency. So I'm not going to read any of this to you, but basically it's what gives the local authority the authority to enter private land, to require people to not enter their property, not enter down a road. We can basically acquire the use of facilities or equipment required to respond to that emergency. Things such as heavy equipment to create a fire break or to have people move away from floodwaters because floodwaters rising into their home. We can cause the evacuations and removal of livestock, different things like that. Some of the ones that we don't use too often is things like price fixing. We actually can prevent people from overcharging for food, gasoline, those essential items. We can cause the demolition, removal of any structures. So back in the early 2000s, when Strawberry Hill in Kamloops was on fire, the community of Kamloops had to bulldoze homes. So it is this act and this state of local emergency that gave them that ability to actually destroy private property to help save other private property. So there's a number of things that whenever we contemplate putting in a state of local emergency, we have to contemplate each and every one of these powers very carefully because they are an infringement upon people's human rights, and they are very powerful. So we do contemplate each one quite seriously, and if it is actually required. Whenever we declare a state of local emergency, that declaration goes up to the minister and we get ministerial approval, and they review those authorities and those powers that we've asked to be enacted, and they can be refused. So a minister can say, you don't need that power, or I don't approve your state of local emergency. So it is a purposeful exercise that we do, that isn't taken lightly. So the principles of emergency management are pretty straightforward. There are four, and these four principles are what's known as the Sendai framework. I'm not sure if it's a Japanese word. So the first framework is to prevent and mitigate. So this is where the new modernization of the Emergency Program Act is going to focus. It's on that prevention and mitigation. Number two is to prepare. So we prepare for disasters. Number three is to respond, and number four is to recover. Over the years, because of nature, people tend to focus more on the response. It's just human nature to do. So with this new legislation, the provincial government is hoping to focus more on that prevent, mitigate, and the prepare. So try to have a more holistic approach to emergency management, not just the response portion. So this is just how that Sendai framework sort of works into emergency management. So in pre-incident, we really want to focus on that prevention and mitigation and preparedness. During the incident, we start the response and we start to think about the recovery. Post-incident, it's again, prevention and mitigation. Some of you may have heard the words build back better. So in the prevention and mitigation, especially on the mitigation, communities that have undergone a disaster, places like Slave Lake or Fort McMurray, they're talking about building back better. So if you have to build again, build it better, build it in such a manner that it can withstand these types of incidents, whether it be floods or fires or climate change. So that's where the mitigation still exists in that post-incident. And of course, the minute we're in the response phase, we always try to start thinking about the recovery phase. What's going to happen when we get through this initial response, and how are we going to recover, and how are we going to get our residents back to where they started? So it is a loop. As you work through the incident and the post-incident, you always have that continuous improvement process, the examination of all of our actions at all of these stages. And we circle it back to the start, and then we just prepare and hopefully prevent it from happening again. And it's just a constant loop. So one of the first steps, so over on the left, is something called a hazard risk and vulnerability analysis. So this is basically an examination of all of the different hazards that exist in our area. So we sort of basically just brainstorm anything that could potentially happen. And then we examine and we try to evaluate what's the risk that that specific hazardous event will occur. So 5 years ago, nobody thought a pandemic would have happened truly to the degree that it did, but it is in all of our plans. It just didn't have a very high risk associated to it. One of our higher risks, of course, is wildfire. Flooding isn't a very high risk throughout the majority of the municipality, but it is a bit of a higher risk up in the north area where the communities are a little bit closer to the river levels. And of course, weather event flooding, so overland flooding is a risk throughout the entire municipality. But wildfire is our number 1 risk. So then you examine the possibilities, the possible vulnerabilities should that event occur. So where are we vulnerable? What infrastructure is vulnerable? What residents are vulnerable? And in the new Emergency Program Act, we also look at cultural sites. What cultural sites are vulnerable? So how vulnerable is Old Fort from a flood event of the Musqueam? Then we have to take a look at the adverse impacts that that hazard event might have on identified vulnerability. So we examine that. Then we always want to include both natural and human and technological hazards. So within our emergency response plan, we have plans for wildfires and floods, but we also have plans for what if a person or persons contaminated our water supply. So that could be a very human act. We also contemplate acts of terror and things like that. So we're just starting to explore the technological hazards. So spam, people taking over your network, those kinds of things. And the other thing that we do in our hazard risk and vulnerability analysis is we layer multi-hazard events over top of one another. So what if you have a wildfire at the same time you're having a flood? What if you have different things happen, because a lot of times these events don't happen by themselves. They are layered upon other events. So we also take a look at those kinds of vulnerabilities. One of the areas that local governments can really start to have some impact is in prevention and mitigation. One of the bigger areas is land use management. So in the land use management realm, we have things of restricting development on floodplains. We have preserving slope stability. We have setback allowances. We have the relocation of structures. We have siting provisions within zoning. All of those are strategies, especially when we go into an OCP process, that we can really take a look at and incorporate the new risks that are associated with climate into where we do things and where we permit as a local government things to occur when it comes to development. We can start to develop greater risk awareness around those risks that are prevalent within our region. So things such as promoting fire smart awareness campaigns, promoting influenza vaccinations, promoting vaccinations just in general. So plus in ourselves, we can take protective measures and we can encourage others to do the same. We can institute infrastructure guidelines around seismic impact. So this is earthquake preventiveness and mitigating earthquake impacts to buildings. We can advocate for stronger building standards when it comes to earthquakes if we were in an earthquake zone. So one of the places you guys might recall back in Calgary in June of 2013 was a major flood that happened throughout southern Alberta. So the city of Calgary looked back upon, and the city of High River looked back upon their developments and their OCP. They had permitted developing all along the floodplain. So this is one area when you talk about build back better, or don't let people build back in that exact same spot. Don't let them put homes back in the floodplain. We've all heard comments like, the 1 in 100 events when it comes to flooding and stuff like that. And these events are no longer just 1 in 100 years. They're coming more often and they're coming more frequently thanks to climate change. So it is the contemplation of these kinds of limitations that you set in your OCPs and you set in your development areas that can really impact future mitigation for hazards. So just an example that I thought was quite interesting and really quite well relevant to local governments. Preparedness is our next phase. So this is all about planning. So planning for effective response through responsible emergency management. So have a good, thorough emergency management program. Ensure that those who are responsible for emergency management have adequate resources, staffing, mutual aid agreements, developing partnerships. There's resources are people, resources are items, and resources is just the processes that we have. Training our response and recovery personnel. We also need to exercise our emergency response plan. That way it becomes second nature when we need to activate. And we need to continuously promote awareness through our community and through all of our contacts about emergency preparedness. So just some examples of things that we've done locally. So we always distribute our Prepared BC literature. A number of years ago, we put in the Voyant Alert app. You can see that's the old copy of our emergency response plan. For our new counselors who may or may not be aware, we actually have a drone program as well. So we have a program where we have a very large drone that we can utilize in emergency. We have a infrared lens on it. So it can be used by search and rescue personnel. It can be used by fire personnel. It can be used by the RCMP. So then the top right-hand corner is our new EOC stores. So what you're looking at is cots, bedding, pillows to house 100 people. So back in the day, we had to replace some very outdated Korean War emergency management things. So we've acquired some more modern tools. So we can now house 100 people in our recreation center. And at the bottom there is just a picture from an airport emergency exercise that was happening for, that's a triage being performed by the fire department. All right, so our response. So the response is the short term and how we deal with the short term effects of an incident and how do we immediately try to reduce loss and suffering. So we do that through a number of ways. We apply appropriate resources to the site of an incident. We dispatch fire, we dispatch our EOC. We activate our emergency response plan. We activate our emergency operations center. We issue warnings and advisories. We institute public health measures. We declare a state of local emergency. We initiate evacuations or shelter in place, and we provide assistance to impacted people through either reception centers, group lodging. We do warming centers. Our rec center is also designated a clean air center. So in the event of air contaminants or a smoke event that doesn't require us to evacuate, but people with breathing vulnerabilities, we can use the rec center as a clean air center. So those are all just examples of the types of things that would fall under the response. And recovery. So recovery can be an incredibly long phase of emergency management. The community of High River, which was flooded in 2013, 2 years later is still trying to get residents back into their homes. So that picture there is some of the temporary housing that High River put in place for some of the residents that were displaced as part of that flood. So a lot of focus is being put on lately on the psychosocial impacts of disasters. And that's a combination of the psychological and social impacts, i.e. mental health, grief, depression, family separation, loss of purpose that impact the victims of natural disasters. We also need to think about the recovery of our physical structure and infrastructure. The recovery of our environment, so soil contaminants, water quality, air quality, and of course, economic recovery. So loss of income, loss of building contents, structural damage, additional living costs. So all of those are parts of recovery. Our emergency response and evacuation plan is it's a very thick document and has a number of parts, and it keeps getting bigger, but it's a fulsome emergency response plan. It includes a water treatment emergency plan. It includes our hazard and risk vulnerability analysis, or I just call it the HRVA. It includes Fort Nelson First Nations pandemic plan, and it includes the general ERP. It also includes the airport emergency response plan. Back in 2013, our ERP and our HRVA both received significant revisions. And in 2013, it was a very proud moment when our ERP became a joint one with Fort Nelson First Nations, and it was one of the first in the province. And I'm still sharing it, and EMBC, which is Emergency Management BC, still shares our emergency response plan as a model for other communities to try to achieve, because we were ahead of the curve on that one, which is kind of nice. It is a living document. It continuously undergoes significant revisions and updating. The province is just about done as part of the modernization program. They're developing the new HRVA tool, so we're going to be doing updating our HRVA. Our evacuation plan was quite old. It was from 2001. We received grant funding in 2019, and we now have an updated evacuation plan as well. So our EOC, once we're done with this presentation, we're going to adjourn this meeting, and I'm going to take you upstairs for a bit of a tour of our EOC. It's a little bit set up there, so we can sort of walk you through some of the things that we've been able to achieve over the past few years. But what that center does is its purpose is to support the personnel that are involved in supporting the incident. So we collaboratively support site activities, we coordinate information, and we provide strategic direction during an emergency or disaster. So that's what the EOC actually does. We have the responsibility for site support and consequence management. We provide policy and strategic direction through council down into those that are on the ground. We collect information, we evaluate it, and we distribute it. We coordinate agencies and/or departments. We manage the resources. So if a responding agency needs a thing, whatever that thing might be, they could call us and we will try and get that thing. So anywhere from boats to planes to helicopters to food and water, we will try to get the thing, whatever it is that they need. That's one of the activities that we do in the EOC. And we also manage the internal and external communications about the event. So all of that goes through the EOC. Some of the recent emergency management initiatives that we've done and over the last 5 or 6 years. So it started off back in 2015 and 16. We got a new generator put on Municipal Hall. It's a natural gas generator. Its main purpose was to power our email server, and we were able to bring the EOC from the fire hall to Municipal Hall. So we did that for a couple of reasons. Is if you've ever been in the fire hall during an emergency, it's very loud, it's very busy, and it's very crowded. So there's not a lot of room over there. So an EOC needs to have the ability to function. It needs to be a place where the EOC personnel can come and work, and we shouldn't be bothering those that are involved in the direct response. So we established our EOC here at Municipal Hall. In 2017, we had a really nice program in partnership with Fort Nelson First Nation and the First Nation Emergency Services Society. And that's when we began our Fire Smart training. And that was when we got our UAV. So that's when we got our drone. So that was a multi-year project. And part of that project, we collected a lot of really important data with the use of drones on our wildland urban interface for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. That was part of that program. And in 2018 and 19, we've been very successful with UBCM's Community Emergency Preparedness Fund grants. This was the first of ones that we got where we were able to get all of those cots and beddings to do group lodging. And we were able to start to get some of our EOC supplies, so vests and storage totes and that. Also in 2018-19, we were able to get a lot of supplies from the same program to expand our generator's ability to now service the Raven Room. So we got backup power into the Raven Room, and we were able to put in a number of redundant electronic services in there, including cell boosters, Wi-Fi boosters. We have a separate set of phone lines that go into that room. We can do wired network. We can do independent Wi-Fi. It paid for the large TV that's in that room. We also got some backup light sources, and we were able to get some EOC laptops. In 2018 and 19, we updated our emergency response plan in partnership with FNFN and part of an INAC grant. So that was a nice partnership. In 2020 and 2021, we launched NRRM Alert, which is our municipal alerting system. We selected that one for a very specific reason, because it will not only just do text, but it will also do standard phone. It will dial people's phone numbers. And so for those, especially since we are a very large region and people don't have text messages up north, so we wanted that ability to have other ways to get a hold of the residents within the municipality. So having something that would actually dial a standard phone number was quite important to us. So, and in 2019 and 2020, we also did this when we updated our evacuation plans in partnership with Port Nelson First Nations. We did planning sessions up in Toad River, and we did a joint community planning session with Port Nelson First Nations over in the community hall, and we were able to also bring in Prophet River First Nation to update our evacuation plan. That was a successful one as well. In 21, we began acquiring our own push-to-talk satellite communication system. So in the event of a complete communications outage within our region, we can now deploy a push-to-talk satellite communication system. And we were able to acquire some more laptops and portable printers. So we also have the ability to deploy a completely portable ESS registration system with electronic registration and printers versus having people fill out multi-part forms. And as you were aware, we just applied for more grant funding to continue to expand our EOC communications capacity. So we're looking to expand that push-to-talk satellite system. And we're looking to get some more supplies and equipment to expand our EOC capabilities. Because right now, when we go upstairs, you'll see during an activation, I take over the entire Raven room, which I don't need a lot of the time. Sometimes I just need a dedicated space to be able to set up and have the EOC sort of secure. So during an activation, we lose the ability. So work still occurs, the municipality's business still goes on, but we lose a meeting room, an entire meeting room. So we're looking to dedicate that back room. It used to be the video conference room in the corner. We're looking to sort of secure that down and have that as sort of a mini EOC activation. So we don't have to take up the entire Raven room. And it's easy enough to bring our bit of backup power just across a wall. So just extension cord, exactly. Just an extension cord. So it's nice and close. So that's as part of that new grant application, that's what we're looking to do. So acquire another smaller television to put in there, a desk, and yeah, we've already got all the locks installed, so it's underway. Any questions?
Any comments or questions from council?
No?
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So during an emergency, other than the grants for the preparedness, who funds the actual emergency? Is it the province? Do we have reserves for that? Where does the money
Depends
come
on the activity. So under that piece of legislation that was at the bottom of that big black slide that talked about the provincial legislation was the financial assistance guideline. That piece of legislation actually determines what activities are recoverable from the province. So for instance, during an activation, it will cover, so if my particular hours of work were from 8 to 6, and my time between 8 and 6 was dedicated to emergency management, a applicable event, the municipality couldn't charge and get reimbursed for that time. But any time I spend after 6, any overtime that I have, that is reimbursable to the municipality. there's a process by which if we want to have something reimbursed, we have to get permission to purchase it first. So there's a equipment reserve request that we put into EMBC, and they'll tell us if they fund it. They have some odd rules. They don't like us to purchase things. They like us to rent or lease them. So even if it's more expensive to rent or lease a piece of equipment, they don't want us to purchase it. They want us to rent or lease it. So we are very careful to try to ensure that we don't incur any direct cost to the municipality whenever possible. We try to always get do things that we will get recovered back for. If there's something that's going to have a great cost to the municipality that the province says that they won't cover, we would come to council to get permission for that purchase, because then it would not be recoverable. So, yeah.
One more question. How exactly does the Voyant Alert system work? Do people have to opt in, provide their information?
Yes.
Is it automatic or?
Nope.
Okay.
So the only system that is automatic is the one that comes from the province. That the provincial wide alert system that comes from the province is automatically pushed to any mobile device that is in the region that they determine. Our Voyant Alert system is opposite. It needs subscription. So you need to go to Voyant Alert, you need to sign up, and you can select a method by which you would like to receive those alerts. So you can select email, text, SMS, phone call, and it's completely anonymous. So you can go in and just say, I want to put you put a pin on a map and you say, this is my home, this is my work, and you attach a number to that. And I have no idea that whoever has done it or hasn't done it. During that process, you do have the ability to fill that information in though. So you can say that I am so-and-so and this is my information, but you don't have to. It's can be completely anonymous. So
just a follow-up question for Voyant Alert. What are some of the things that Voyant Alert can't do? I remember we had a gunman in the community, and I had quite a few questions from the public wondering why there wasn't a Voyant Alert issued during that situation, even though some businesses and other places were on lockdown. What are the limitations of that particular system?
do you mean limitations technically, or limitations as to when we would or wouldn't use it?
I guess what would constitute a public Voyant Alert for the community? What are some of the things?
That determination, the use of that system would really depend on our own policies and procedures. In the instance that you are referencing, that was not our instance, and that was an instance that was controlled by the RCMP, and we were not directed to do that. So we will not communicate something that we're not directed to communicate, because so we've communicated a couple of things in the past, but it's always been in cooperation with the agency. So when Northwest Tel, we had a complete outage of our phone systems. We were in communications with Northwest Tel, and we communicated that complete outage of our phone systems. So because it is it's an intrusive system as well. We don't want people to become too complacent about those things. So we are pretty careful. Some communities use them for like water main breaks or road closures. And you can select the type of thing that you, the type of alert that you send out. But we evaluate the use of the tool depending upon the need that's happening. But we do need the permission of the lead agency, I will call it, before we alert for something that isn't our emergency. And the gun in the community was not our emergency. Our EOC was not even activated during that. So. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions?
No.
Okay, hearing none, I'll move on to the.
Sorry, I'm not quite done.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just pausing. That's okay. Sorry. Let's have a couple. Just a couple of notes. So, so one of the things some people may not be aware of, but back in 2011, the community of Slave Lake lost their brand new town hall, and they lost 33% of their community. So this particular wildfire started as arson. It started 15 kilometers outside the community of Slave Lake. And 100-kilometer-an-hour winds pushed that particular wildfire through a fire break and into the community within, I think it hit the community within about a day. The fire itself was from May 14th to 16th. 433 buildings were destroyed. It burned 1,200 acres and cost back then $750 million in damage. And its cause was arson. So that's just one of the, this particular incident, I wasn't very involved in emergency management back then, but most people who are call this one the wake-up call. This was the one that really started to highlight how fast our climate is changing and how it is impacting how fire moves through our landscape now. So this was one of those ones. But unfortunately, we didn't learn fast enough. So in 2016, another big one hit. This one hit Fort McMurray. So this one started on May 1st, and it burned 1.4 million acres. It destroyed 3,244 buildings, and it caused the evacuation upwards of 88,000 people. So this one also moved very quickly. It jumped rivers. It was driven by high winds, and it took the community of Fort McMurray by surprise. This is a recent thing that came out from the province. So it's a bit of a history of the province-wide hectares burned by wildfire. So wildfire seasons tend to be cyclical in nature. So you're going to have a couple bad, then a couple good, maybe a couple more good, and then maybe a few bad. But you can see how it goes up and down. In recent history, 2018 is still the worst fire season in history in terms of province hectares burned. So 1.3 million hectares were burned in 2018. When you take a look at it, 1.3% of the province burned that year. That was a bad year. Locally, we had a number of events. So going from left to right, on the left there is the Radar Road fire that started on May 11th, 2018. Our season can start very fast and very quickly. That was caused when some brush burning got out of control. Right down the middle is the Musqueam River fire, May 20th, 2018. So our biggest risk is between now and green up. So from a landscape, our landscape is dry. Our biggest risk, we haven't greened up yet. So between now and when we can actually get green up is when our biggest risk occurs. And over on the right-hand side, that's the Clark Lake Road fire. That was June 21st. And that's the one that interrupted the tea dance that night from Fort Nelson First Nations. That was also an interesting evening. In last year, we had 247 wildfires within the Prince George Fire Center. You can see 2018 poking its head up there at 451. That was a bad year. You can see the start of COVID, nobody was in the bush, 57 in the Prince George Fire Center. So it's quite telling how much human impact can have on the number of fires that we have. When you have a year when nobody is out in the bush, when industry isn't working, when people are on lockdown, we don't have a lot of fires. Within the Prince George Fire Center, this was also a bit of a history. Last year, it was a medium year for us, but again, you can see the impacts of COVID. 256 hectares burned in 2020. One of the things for the Prince George Fire Center, though, that I think is noted is while 2018 was provincially a bad year, 2015 was a bad year for us. So that's the highest point on this graph at 213,000 hectares burnt in 2015. We had a couple of our bigger events. So this is when we had the Prophet River, Kluwa Lake fire. We put Prophet River on evacuation alert for 10 days and supported them through that process. People probably remember the forestry camp set up across the highway down in the Prophet River area. 2015 was also the year of the Big Beaver Creek fire that shut down the Alaska Highway. So, and that was only 50 kilometers south of town. Good thing the wind was driving it and across ways. It wasn't driving it towards the community. It was driving it across the fire, but it's still a big scar on the landscape now. When you drive south, and you can still see that, the impacts of that particular fire down there. So now I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Okay, moving on, public news media question and answer period. Are there any attendees who wish to comment on the meeting? virtually in person? Okay. Hearing none, I will declare the meeting adjourned and we'll go upstairs and take a look at the Raven Room and the emergency